that's logged on so far. Obviously, just introduce myself. I'm Ashley at Oliver Bernard. If you haven't done this but been on here with us before, obviously we had quite a successful one 2 weeks ago. We're going to try and pick things up with this and run these events on a weekly basis going forwards. Just looking to keep everybody connected. Bit of knowledge sharing, a bit of a Q&A at the end as well to try and push some positivity around the community at the moment and keep everybody connected, whilst there's a lot of uncertainty and negativity going on at the moment as well. Tonight we've got a brilliant talk lined up from Elizabeth. She's going to run through her experiences of accessibility testing. She'll give you an insight into where to get started, what good design looks like, and how to build accessibility into an already live offering. We'll try and keep the questions for the end. So if any time through the talk you do have any questions, if you can just drop a note in the chat function and be able to pick up on those at the end. Obviously these events are recorded, so you can have a look back once they're shared out. And if you've got any other questions, then just drop us a line either to myself or Elizabeth, or put that into the meetup page and she'll be able to respond to you directly from there. But yeah, I'll pass you over to Elizabeth now. Any questions, as I say, just drop that in the chat function and we'll catch up at the end.
Okay, Ashley, could you just stay online? Can you hear me okay still?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
All right, brilliant. Hopefully that means everyone else can as well. Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for joining this evening. Like Ashley said, for anyone who joined a little bit late, I'll go through any questions there are at the end. If you just drop them into the chat window, it'll mean that I can get to them all eventually. Okay, so this is accessibility for beginners. It is going to be focused on web accessibility in particular, but if you've got any questions around any other type of application accessibility, I'll do my best to try and deal with them at the end. This workshop is not just my work, it's the work of multiple testers and UX people that I led sort of in putting this together. So I've put their names on the screen there so you can appreciate how much time and effort went into producing this. Okay, so this is me, Elizabeth Fines. I work for a consultancy here in London. I'm on Twitter, but I'm very sweary, so if you don't like that sort of thing, don't follow me on Twitter. I'd hate to offend anybody unknowingly. I'm also on LinkedIn, where I don't swear because HR have been very clear that I'm not allowed to do that. So if you want to follow me on a platform where I don't swear as much, or it's implied, that's the place to do it. So what is accessibility? Well, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, it's how easy something is to reach or enter or use or see. That's great and has a lot of applicable functions when you start to think about a web page, but actually it leaves out a ton of underlying detail as well when you think about the operability or the usability of the web. So in terms of navigation and being able to understand and being able to access as well, they're all considerations that we have to take into the fore when we're testing or designing for accessibility. So web accessibility basically it's a product design practice, and it makes sure that everybody that comes into and onto your web pages or your sites can interact with it in the way that you intend. And that's for everybody, no matter what the accessibility support is that they need. So whether that's based around vision or hearing, motor function or cognition. And you know, the message I like to get out there about accessibility is that it's fair and it's inclusive. If you consider this as part of your design and your testing process for your website, you're doing stuff that's fair and inclusive and quite loving in a way, making sure that people can use your products and your service and get access to your information. And just to sort of give you some stats around this, at least 1 in 5 people in the UK have a long-term illness, impairment or disability. Many more have a temporary disability. So whether it's they got a poke in the eye for an umbrella and they've got vision problems for a couple of weeks, or they're permanently blind. There's a whole spectrum of people that benefit when you consider accessibility and build it into your websites. Now, in 2018, in September, new regulations came into force for public web sector body websites. So these are all your council websites, your tax websites in the UK, which say that you have to make your website and mobile app more accessible by making it perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And this is called the public sector bodies accessibility regulations. It is anticipated within the accessibility community that now that government services have gone down this road, that probably the private sector is going to follow suit very soon as well. So where do we get our guidance on how to make websites accessible? Well, there's a series of guidelines called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and these come from the World Wide Web Consortium, and they set the standards basically for the internet. Now, I've mentioned perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust before, and those are the WCAG principles, and we'll go through those, and I'll give you examples of what they are as we go through this presentation as well. So I've been working doing accessibility testing and supporting accessibility design for about 10 years now. And I probably heard every myth that there is out there about accessibility. So I'm going to share some of the ones that kind of seem to bubble up to the surface most often. So the first one is it's all about headings. Well, yeah, absolutely. Headings are a big part of accessibility because without them, screen readers find it very hard to read web pages, but they're not the be all and end all of accessibility. If you include them in your website, that doesn't mean you can kind of go, well, there's accessibility done and dusted. There's a bit more than that to it. And the next one is, oh, it's about contrast. If I have sufficient contrast between my foreground and my text, that means that my website can be easily read, but you can change contrast in the browser, so there's nothing that we need to do to enable this. So contrast alone does not make accessibility, and you should absolutely test how changes in browser contrast affect your site, but first and foremost, you should make sure that there is sufficient contrast between the text on your site and the background that's behind it. This is the one I probably hear most often, that it's expensive and it's time consuming. Well, a lot of the checking tools that you can use for accessibility are free. And if you test for accessibility close to the code in the development stage, rather than waiting till the end of a project, it actually becomes exponentially cheaper than trying to build it in at the end. So if you've been on a project where you've tried to build in accessibility after you've done the main body of the work on developing a system, I can actually see where your perspective of accessibility being expensive comes from. But actually, if you're doing it close to the code, it just becomes another development task, the same as doing the HTML, the same as doing the JavaScript, the same as doing the CSS for your sites. And we'll get sued if people can't use our site. So this one's quite common. And the reason I dislike this myth is because when people believe they're going to be sued, they do the minimum amount of work not to be sued, rather than the maximum amount of work to make their sites as inclusive as possible. So if a workflow is completely inaccessible, that's a bad thing. But if you've provided a workaround, so that if there's a way so that a person doesn't have to use your website, or has a workaround to getting to that functionality or to buy that product or whatever it happens to be, then you can't be sued. And the big example I always give in this area is radio is inaccessible to deaf people as a device, but there's no radio station in the UK or anywhere ever been sued for being accessible. And we will talk about some of the companies that have been sued and why they've been sued later on in this presentation too. And this one has started circulating basically since September 2018. The government will take down our sites if we can't prove that it's been tested and designed to a certain standard. No, they won't. It only applies to public websites, public sector websites right now. And it's not that they'll take them down, it's that they won't allow them to go live if they can't be proven to be tested to a certain standard. And yeah, this is a direct quote from somebody I work with. My user base doesn't have accessibility needs. And as it turned out, what was happening when we analyzed the traffic for the site, there was a lot of abandoned workflows that told us that people were getting frustrated or just giving up on trying to figure out how to do something. And when we looked to engage with those users who'd gone past a certain point in the workflow where they'd given their email addresses, we'd figured at least 50% of them had accessibility issues. And because they couldn't figure out how to get past a certain point, they just gave up. But because this customer hadn't worked out the way to gather this information, they just had no view on it whatsoever, and were of the opinion that none of their users needed this functionality. And then we can just add it in later. Absolutely, of course you can. You can add anything in later to a website that you want. You can add in performance improvements. You can add in security enhancements, but it just becomes much more expensive once you've designed your product in full to then have to go and retrofit accessibility. As I said earlier on, the best time and place to do this is at the coding stage. So the hardest thing about accessibility is not the design of it, it's not the testing of it, it's the persuading people to actually do it. And the beginning of this is getting other people to buy into the idea. So I'm going to look at some models of persuasion that are out there for accessibility, and then talk about their effectiveness. So the shaming. So this is where people have gone publicly and just said, you know what, using the media, I'm going to tell you how dreadful your approach to accessibility is. So the charity Scope publishes a shame list about once a year, talking about how people are effectively shut out of websites, unable to buy products, unable to access information, because the sites are so inaccessible as to be basically unusable. AbilityNet as well. This was quite a damning report that came out at the beginning of 2018, before the Public Sector Accessibility Act came into being. That's almost half UK websites were inaccessible to people with any kind of sight or cognitive impairment. When you consider 1 in 5 in the UK have some sort of impairment, that many people shut out of essential services sites is not okay. And this one, Nipron is quite a big speaker in accessibility circles. He was invited to do a talk, and the stage itself was inaccessible. He actually had to be lifted onto the stage, which is, you know, not absolutely brilliant if you're been invited to speak on that very subject on a panel. And then this one kind of struck home. All the kids excited to see Star Wars given the latest release this year, and still there are cinemas out there that aren't able to extend this experience to people with hearing loss who need subtitles to help them enjoy and understand the film. So, you know, having to travel hundreds of miles to see your favorite film because of a lack of accessibility considerations isn't a great look. So the consequences, and this is mostly about getting sued. There is a pressure group in America at the moment that is taking the legal approach to getting accessibility built into websites. I'm not a big fan of this, like I said, because people do the bare minimum rather than the most inclusive. But yeah, so what's basically been happened since AOL were sued, I think it was 2002, is that the amount of accessibility suits in the US is going up year on year to triple in 2018. So people that have been working in software and the IT industry for a while are probably aware of BMI Baby being one of the first sites to be sued over accessibility in the UK back in 2012. In the US, the National Association of the Deaf took Harvard University to court, as well they should, because the university making their resources and access to them as a learning institute inaccessible is just so unfair, it's ridiculous. Beyonce is not immune, as brilliant as she is, she's not immune for being, or her entertainment facilities are not immune for being sued for lack of accessibility as well. And then the big one that got everyone talking last year was around Domino's, who it was later proven that the accessibility changes that were needed to make them accessible to blind people would have taken about $40,000 to build into their platform. They're now burning through millions trying to get the original decision repealed, which is just it's just a logic that defeats me, quite frankly. And then the third method of persuasion for accessibility is referring to the law. So there's three sets of legislation that probably affects us here in the UK. There's the UK legislation, which is the Disability Act of 2010. There's related EU legislation, although after Brexit, how closely we're going to have to adhere to that is up for debate. And then there's the Irish one as well, because a lot, you know, you have a lot of Irish people buying from British websites and things like that. So whatever changes that you make to your website, but because they're based on the same set of standards, they tend to follow each other fairly closely. So if you follow the WCAG2 guidelines, you're pretty safe for both jurisdictions. And now we start to talk about the upside of actually investing in accessibility. And this is kind of why I keep pushing for making sites as accessible. If you want to really get down to brass tacks and be quite vulgar about it, you make more money if you build accessibility into your sites. The more people you give access to being able to buy your product or service or buy into your information, the more of a return that you're going to get. The big example that we know of in retail was when Tesco built accessibility into their website back in the late 90s. They estimated that the average spend in a £100 basket went up by 10% across the board, and not just with people with accessibility needs. That's because when you build in accessibility for everyone, you make your website easier to use for everyone. So of course people are going to use it more. And we have the silver pound that we refer to for people that are elderly that shop, and it's known as the purple pound for people who have accessibility needs that want to use your websites. And then, you know, who benefits when we do this? So we have, nobody likes being told this, but everyone's getting older. And as you get older, your senses need more help, or they start to deteriorate a bit. As we get older, as every one of us gets older, our accessibility needs will increase. That means that sooner or later, everyone, no matter how perfect your eyesight, no matter how great your hearing, no matter how brilliant at yoga you are, no matter if you can remember 100 to the strength of pi right now, at some point in your life as you get older, you will have accessibility needs. So building accessibility in benefits the whole of society. It benefits your company as well. So you don't want to work for a company that has a reputation for building inaccessible software. Wouldn't you rather have an accessibility rating on your websites that you can be proud of, and on your products that you can be proud of? Also, your employees benefit as well. Who wants to work for a company that's had an avalanche of bad PR about their inaccessible web products? I certainly don't. And if you use accessible products as well as produce them, you can increase the sheer scope of people that are able to work for you as well. And then you yourself, like, who doesn't want the feeling that they're opening up the web to more and more people as part of their great design practices? You get to feel really good about doing stuff like that. And it's a really good feeling to kind of come to the end of a delivery product and send something out there knowing that you have done your best to make it accessible to as many people as possible. And then, you know, your family benefits, those with permanent and semi-permanent conditions. I don't know about you, but I come from a big Irish family, and recycling devices is massive. I think my first phone is with my 11-year-old cousin at the moment, and this is like an old iPhone with a terrifyingly slow browser and all this, but she still uses it for the web. So, you know, by making sure that our relatives who are using older devices and stuff like that can access our web pages, we're making them as accessible as possible in that way as well. Our countrymen and women, so this is a UK talk by somebody who's Irish, whose first language is Irish and second language is English. So I'm very conscious about the fact that not everybody comes to the web with their first language as English. So if you have relatives in other countries that are coming to the web, maybe for the first time in their lives, you want to make that web as accessible and understandable for them as you can. Customers alike who mightn't be fluent in the language that you write your website in. And then, yeah, I've talked about ourselves as we get older and we start to, you know, start to deteriorate gently a bit. And then a little bit of inspiration. So here's what, when accessibility is really taken in as a consideration and applied properly. So you get things like quiet hours in supermarkets introduced, and this translates directly to a design practice on websites, where you make websites as uncluttered as possible for people to use. I love this as a solution. So this is a building where they couldn't get planning permission to build a ramp because it's an old building. It was under a building order. So what they did was they thought, okay, fine, we'll do something that's completely independent of the building, but actually still supports it. So they built an independent ramp that's retractable, so it can be stored easily. Mobility scooters for getting around supermarkets without pain. This translates directly on a web page to indicators that tell you very clearly about what stuff is. Have you ever wondered why beside a search box there's a magnifying glass and the word search? It's to indicate as clearly as possible the function of that piece of that website and make it as easy as possible to get around. I love these. If you're going into a shop and you're overwhelmed and you don't want to talk to someone, you pick a black basket and you're left to go around. If you are going in and you don't know where anything is and you'd like to be helped, you pick a red basket. This is great. This is like having that little contact chat icon on a website, but it doesn't pop up when you go to the website. You choose it and say, you know what, I want a little bit of help with what I'm doing. And it's a really, really powerful message to give to your customers, to say that you're considering them in this way. And then wide aisles, they're not just good for kids to go down on wheelies, they're also good because supermarkets are quite visually overwhelming for people. So actually having a little bit of space to be able to think is very important, so you don't get overwhelmed in those sort of very busy environments. And then training, the most important thing at all, training people to be aware so they have empathy. Some visibilities are visible, some are very invisible. So actually offering your people the training to understand how that comes across and what people's needs are in terms of software is a brilliant thing to be able to do. So basically what I've just done is gone through the whole of WebIM's hierarchy for pushing out and influencing accessibility change in your organization. And what they've done is put it in this chart and talked about effectiveness. So the guilt that I talked about at the beginning, those stories where kids can't go to see Star Wars in the cinema, they're quite frequently in the papers, but they change very little. But they do sell newspapers and they do get clickbait when they're online. So that's why they're used. But inspiring, actually truly getting people to understand accessibility and the benefit of it, that's the one that's the most highly effective. So you might think kind of, well, why don't we just run straight to inspiration every time? Why do we bother with the guilt? Because it's the effort required. So, you know, publishing a newspaper story, writing a tweet, all those sort of things that inspire the guilt, they're quite easy and don't take a huge amount of effort to do. Really inspiring people and getting them to understand the benefit of accessibility, that takes legwork and time to be able to do. which is why people tend to go to the guilt and punish ends of the scale, like America are doing at the moment, rather than the enlighten and inspire end, which gets much better results. But there is no reason why you can't do a combination of one or more of these. And the most effective one would be to use ones from sort of the middle and the top to get your point across. So supporting people with visual challenges to be able to use your websites and your products. So globally, the WHO estimates that 1.3 million, that's 17% of the world's population, have a visual impairment. Of those, 36 million are completely blind. And the majority of these people are over 50. So this is an example of what good accessible visual design looks like. It's the RNIB website, unsurprisingly. And the reasons why this is really good designs is it has clear, distinct links to the other parts of the site. So that makes it understandable. And we talked about the POUR principles. That's perceivable, operable, robust, and reliable at the beginning of this. So this is, this is understandable. It's not a cognitive overload to take on if you're vision impaired. There's clear headings, which screen readers will be able to easily read for those that use them. Also, the website, it reorders to accommodate Zoom. So if you want to increase the size of the page up to 160, you can, and all the elements in it will reorder to allow you to do that. There's a search box at the top of the page. So this is predictable design. You've put stuff where people expect to find it. And then it's nice and uncluttered as well. So you're not having loads of pop-ups, you're not having music unexpectedly playing. It's just nice and simple, black and white web page. So after today, if you want to go and investigate finding some visual issues for yourself, there is there's a wonderfully dreadful website built for this purpose called The World's Worst Website Ever. You should go and have a browse around that and see what sort of issues that affect people with visual issues are present on that site. And if you have trouble finding them, there is a link in there where the site author actually lists out all the issues that he's built into the site as well. So if you want to do this closer to the code, and now this is the absolute basics. This is not all the rules that make HTML visually acceptable, but these are a good start for beginner sessions. So headings should always be in headings tags. Paragraphs should be marked with a P. If you're emphasizing something, it should be in the emphasis tags. And related parts of a page should be in a section. So if you're having different sections on, so say you're a supermarket and you've got offers of the day, you've got our fresh meat counter, you've got our going, gone section or whatever, these should all have a dedicated section on their own to make it easier for screen readers to be able to identify them. So I've given an example here of, this is perfectly okay code if you don't want to build accessibility into your websites. So I haven't put any headings, paragraphs, emphasis, or any sections around this. So I decided to give this code a bit of a cleanup. And now it looks a little bit more like something that could be read by a screen reader quite easily. I've got my section headings to note that it's entire sections. I've got the header name, which we read out by a screen reader. I've put emphasis where I want something within the text to be emphasized by the screen reader. I've ended my paragraph nicely, and I've made sure to shut my section ending as well. And there's a couple of tools that you can use to have a look at your code in this way as well. So Renderer will render any raw HTML for you that you can have a look at in advance. And then if you deploy your code somewhere, you can use the WC3 validation service to actually put your URL in, and that will go through the code and sort of tell you where it sees issues. So supporting people with audio challenges. So around 466 million people worldwide have a degree of hearing loss. of whom 34 million are children. And with more and more developing countries coming online, they reckon the next 1 million users of the internet will be coming from Asia and African countries. We need to be making sure that these children who are coming online are actually able to use the web. It's also estimated that by 2050, which is not that far away and getting nearer every time I do this presentation, we'll have over 900 million people with actually a debilitating level of hearing. So we really need to be considering how we're making our website accessible for people with hearing challenges. So my favorite example to use for really good audio design is BBC iPlayer, because it's just awesome. So here in the example that I've used, this is the Infinite Monkey Cage, which is one of my absolute favorite things on the radio. And here they've made it ultimately accessible by putting it on the TV. So we've got closed captions for the hard of hearing. So that makes this perceivable. People can understand it. The subtitles keep pace with what is being said. This is really important. I see so many subtitles that are just way ahead or way behind what's being said, which is really, really confusing if you can't hear what's going on. You can have different size options, and here I've emphasized this in the little pink or purple box, or it might be green if you've been paying attention to internet debates about color this week. You can change the size of the subtitles as well to make them more readable for the device that you're accessing BBC iPlayer from. The subtitles are correct. I don't know who or what is the technology that does subtitles on ITV, but sometimes I have the news on in the afternoon when I'm at home, and it's not great, whoever is doing the transcription services. In this day and age, it definitely needs a revisit. And then the content can actually be played at different speeds. So if you're using an older browser that can't support HD, very fast internet type features, you can choose to download this at a slower speed. And that means that this becomes accessible to people on older phones, older laptops, or using older browsers. So accessible audio design. So this is an example of very bad subtitles, because you just have no idea of what the context is, what's going on. It just says reporters speak own languages. That's not actually very helpful in sort of telling the story of what's going on this. And even when I watched, this is from the Ab Fab film, which my daughter was watching, and I was half watching it, but just this bit I kind of gave up and went, I have no clue what's going on here. This is from a Netflix show called I Am Not Okay With This, and Netflix are awesome at subtitles. They really have taken the time to think about how to do this properly. So this was when it was paused. So on the screen right now, there's dialogue going on, there's music playing in the background. There's, because it's paused, there's an indicator of what the season is and the episode name. There's the series name, and they've managed to put all this on the screen and make it distinguishable of what everything is. So the music is clearly indicated by these little music notes here. Speech is indicated with the little dash there. They've actually combined the words and music together to make a joke as well. And if you read it, it almost reads like the one sentence. And when you pause the program, none of the text overlays each other. You can actually read everything on the screen, and that is some excellent planning as regards subtitles. Yeah, I'm a real big fan of the way they do it. If you want to go and investigate some issues for yourself, it's not actually that easy to find websites that are inaccessible to people with hearing issues, I'm really glad to say. But for some reason, this old ad for You've Got Mail, a film, they forgot to put subtitles on it retrospectively. So if you go and watch it, it's very hard, unless you've seen the film, to actually understand what's going on. So if you want to go and have a look at that yourselves in your own time. There's also an interesting concept around idea around this, that mail is a very dated 1990s idea, so it makes it very hard for people without the concept that they're talking about email to understand what's going on at all. And if you're going closer to the code for accessibility issues for those who are hard of hearing, I've just had a look at assistive tech in this instance, and that's the one that does transcription for any speech that or sound that's going on screen. So assistive tech needs to know where transcript begins, and you do this with transcript IDs in your code. It needs to know what language you're doing your captions in, and this can be done in transcript by the relate transcript title. And for every transcript, and this is from myself personally, read them as soon as possible. Even if you're just reading raw code or text files, you need to visually check them yourself. If there are multiple speakers in a transcript, you need some way to indicate this or call this out. On TV, I've seen they use different colors for different speakers, which is one way of doing it. And if you want people to be able to retrospectively come back to certain points in your transcript, you must include timestamps. And then what I've done is I've given you some code there where I've put this in action. So you've got your transcript ID here telling you, whoops, what language it's in. You've got your relate transcript for your title as well. Sorry, transcript ID telling you where you begin. You've got your relate transcript telling you that's going to be in English. We've called out where there's multiple speakers, and we've said where a particular piece of text begins and ends as well. So supporting people with motor-based challenges. So about 720 million people experience significant motor function challenges. And this is where they have a limb that doesn't work properly. And most particularly, we're talking about hand function, arm function for the purposes of web browsing. And that's 100 million worldwide with very significant difficulties. So if you're relying on something that requires fine motor skills, such as a mouse, to be able to access parts of your website, you're going to make that website inaccessible to people who simply cannot use implements like mice to browse your website. So this is what good accessible motor design looks like. It's perceivable. You've got the distinct color and graphic focus. You've got large clickable areas for when the mouse or browsing gets away from the person that you've built the site from, and you've got space in between your elements as well. Your keyboard navigation as well spaced out. If you want a website to go to find mobility issues, I love Ling's Cars. It is a boss website, it has to be said. But actually, in terms of trying to navigate it without a mouse, it's really, really impossible to actually understand where you have navigated to if you're just using the arrow keys or the tab key or shift to try and navigate through the site. Right click is nearly impossible because the elements are all so close to each other. It's a really good site to go to just sort of work on trying to appreciate how hard it can be to navigate without a mouse. And last but definitely not least is supporting people with cognitive issues. And this is all around understanding and retaining information and comprehension. So I'm dyslexic, which is probably what got me interested in accessibility at the same time. So I have huge challenges processing and understanding huge chunks of text, which is a very inaccessible thing to do, to have big walls of text. When people are tired, they find it hard to process information in that way as well. So if you have information on your site chunked down into smaller paragraphs, it not only helps me, but it helps that person that's tired, that's trying to use your site as well. So accessible cognitive design, obviously AbilityNet, which is the UK's accessibility charity. They went and absolutely ruined my point about not having huge chunks of text on your site by having a huge quote on their site from their CEO, Nigel Lewis. But their first paragraph on this page is a great example of sort of keeping it small, 4 to 5 lines of text, and the next one is just a great big of text, but I decided to leave it in there just to show that not even the best intentioned websites can sometimes get it a little bit wrong. But everything else they've done right. So they've got their letter spacing, it's well spaced out. I think this is, when I measured it, it was 1.2 between letters. They've got nice clear headings. Their font sizing is really nice. It's quite a big size. Their line lengths are mostly understandable, and they've got friendly fonts as well. And we'll talk about in a minute about sort of what friendly fonts are for accessibility. And they've put, again, the search box within where I'd expect to find it, with using icons that I would associate with search as well. So I mentioned accessible fonts. So usually the sort of serif curly fonts are the ones that are considered accessible, not the sort of curly fonts that are on the medical records trolley in this picture, but ones like Arial, Book Antiquita, Comic Sans, just not Comic Sans in pink writing with sparkles around it. That's just, we're not in the 90s anymore. You've got to stop doing that. And Georgia as well. Make sure you do build in your contrast between your fonts and your background. Make sure they're a good size, like the ones I just showed you on the AbilityNet website. Variety is the strife of life when it comes to fonts. The least variance, the better. Don't be using 3 or 4 different fonts on your website. It's quite exhausting to read. Colors should be seen and not heard. So do not use colors to indicate function. That's no use to people who are colorblind. They can't tell what you're trying to tell them by using colors on your fonts. And then freeze your under CSS. Oh God. Sorry, even I have grown at my own jokes sometimes. So this means that you should avoid blinking or moving text on your websites, because it's very hard for people with cognitive challenges to be able to read. So to find cognitive issues, the new Captain Marvel site, love the film, not such a fan of the retro site. It looks great and everything, but actually it's incredibly hard to navigate if you've got cognitive function issues. There's music coming from I don't know where, there's pop-ups, there's things flying across the screen, there's flashing. It's yeah, it's quite a challenge if you've got cognitive issues to be able to navigate. So this is all great if you're building, if you're part of a delivery team that's building, but actually what if you go into an environment where their product or their website is already live? Well, you can use existing tools and services to carry out a quick check of that website. You can perform a testing or an audit manually as well, using some of the tips that I've given you in this presentation. You can then talk about the findings with your team. It could be that they've already decided to mitigate some of these with alternative workflows that you're not aware of, but it's good to have that discussion and get to that place where you understand this. And if you find tools that find issues that your team agree do need to be fixed, bake them into your pipelines if you've got the time and you've got the support from the team around you as well. So these are some of the most helpful tools that I've kind of discovered over the last few years and used in anger. Axe is great. It's really, really chatty though. So learn to use the filters on it to just get it to return issues that you're interested in finding. Lighthouse is a great starter tool. If you haven't done accessibility testing or used accessibility tools before, it's very easy to use. It's very intuitive, and it's a great basis for a discussion with your team on the issues that are found. WebHint is a bit more for hardened techies, because you end up sort of writing stuff that you're looking for into the tool, so it almost becomes more like static analysis than with an accessibility focus. And then Wave as well. Wave is a great tool. It's the best one that I found for doing contrast analysis on tools. None of the others come even close, which is why I've included it in there. But maybe you have a specific need for accessibility testing that none of these tools will meet. So I've included a list to the full W3 list of accessibility tools at the bottom of the page. So just to give you an idea of how accessibility and design has changed over the last 10 years, this is the Amazon landing page from 10 years ago. And as you can see, it's quite busy. It's very close together. There's not a lot of room to make a mistake with your mouse. It's quite a lot to take on cognitively. Screen readers must have been really confused as people were trying to browse that. And now have a look at kind of what it looks like now. And it's almost an empty page compared to what it used to be, but there is that space. There's that room for screen readers to be able to understand what's going on. There's lovely contrast between the foreground and the background, and it's nice and simple and easy to navigate. And yeah, I guess now any questions? So I will just go and get the Zoom up and have a look. Thanks for that question, Marie. Would I trust the accessibility score provided by Lighthouse? No. And that's not because of a fundamental distrust of the tool. That's more to do with actually accessibility rating is to do with you and your team and your product as well. So if we go back to the Domino's example, Domino's argued that actually the reason they didn't have to build accessibility into their website was because somebody who was blind, who couldn't read their website, could ring up, which would be great if their staff had been told, who answered the phone, to read out the menu to people who had accessibility issues, but they weren't told to provide that function. So their accessibility rating with that in mind for navigation would have been absolutely huge because they didn't have a workaround in place to bypass that functionality. So it's an indicator, it's a conversation starter, but I don't think it's an absolute. Do you approach accessibility testing, this from Mick Lawson, do you approach accessibility testing on a mobile app any differently to testing on a web app? Yes, absolutely. So we did quite a lot of testing on a project a couple of years ago for progressive web apps, which are supposed to be more performant and faster and all the rest of it. And what we had to decide as a group is actually in terms of base hardware and base browsers and browser types, how are we actually going to launch this web app on the phone and then test accordingly? And as part of that, we made it really clear on the phone app that if this wouldn't install from you, it was not going to support your device or your browser or the install type that you were going to do. You would be amazed how many people go to the Apple store and try and install something on an Android phone. It's hilarious. But we decided to build in the message to the application that actually here's the alternative links to installing for different devices, to try and make it as easy and as accessible for people as possible to be able to install. So yeah, it's about thinking about that sort of landscape, is what devices are we supporting, what browsers on that device, or are we doing it as a native app on that device, and then go from there. think about the orientation on devices as well. What does the app look like? You know, does it, if we reorientate it from landscape to portrait, does everything disappear into one corner, or, you know, do elements reorder and some of them disappear off the screen? It's that sort of thinking around mobile devices that I would do if I was testing a product on a mobile device. Can you throw some light on progressive web apps in website development and its pros and cons? I could, but Mehul, thank you for that question, but I think that's a different talk for a different night, because that's a bit of a a rabbit hole. But the idea of progressive web apps, briefly, is that they are supposed to be more performant, more accessible, and easier to be able to pick up failed installs on than normal applications. And from the accessibility point of view, they are, as long as you build in all the sort of accessibility safeguards that pretty much we've talked about throughout the throughout this talk. So if you're thinking about your end users and understanding what they need, and understanding how to make all the features within your app as accessible as possible, all the same principles still apply. So, you know, you still need to think about it being perceivable, operable, usable, and robust. Abjeet, have you integrated accessibility tools as part of your build pipeline? Yes, so we have integrated several tools. The latest one that I've worked on has been Axe into a CI/CD pipeline, and it works very nicely. It's just, you know, you have it as a called API every time a build is deployed, and it will look at, it looks at the application as a whole. It doesn't just look at the deployed changes, and it works quite nicely. There's quite a few Medium articles and stuff like that out there, but if you'd like something specific, I'm quite happy to share some of the links that I used when I was reading up on how to do this with my team. I'm quite happy to share those links if you want to read about that in depth.
Okay, perfect. I think that's all of the questions for now by the looks of things on there. Yeah, thanks for that talk, Elizabeth. Very insightful, and I think gave a lot of insight into accessibility itself, and how in some cases it's not being considered as much as it probably should. But yeah, in terms of the talk tonight, it has been recorded, so that will be distributed through our YouTube channel, and I'll send that through to the group as well, so everybody's got that. We'll share the information from this as well, try and give you as much to take away from this, as well as much content that you can have to look back on. As well as that, we were saying if you do come away and you have any further questions, or you think of anything tonight, feel free to drop a message on the meetup page, and Elizabeth will be able to come back to that directly, over the next few days. And yeah, as I say, we'll be able to obviously keep going from there. So in terms of these events, obviously this is our second one now. We're looking to try and pick things up and maybe host them every sort of 1 to 2 weeks. So we are looking for speakers. If anybody going forward does want to speak, or has a topic that they wish to speak about, or even if there's a topic that you'd like to hear more about, then obviously please let us know as well, and we can look to try and get something organized for that. And yeah, as I say, I'll share all the details with you from that. But any questions at all, feel free to let me know. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you, Elizabeth, again for the talk tonight. Very insightful again. Yeah, I'll be in touch with everyone over the next few days. Thanks everyone for coming, and yeah, I'll be in touch soon.
Thanks everyone. Thank you. Bye.